morning.
Good morning.
It is indeed an honor for me to be here. I have to say that Bishop Favreau so eloquently covered all the main points of my talk that I thought we might Quaker-like engage in an hour of holy silence. I've been asked to offer a few presentations today on various aspects of what is variously called an ecclesiology or a spirituality of communion. Blessed John Paul II famously observed some 20 years after the close of the council that communion was effectively the central theological concept undergirding much of the Second Vatican Council's writings. And again, in his wonderful pastoral letter, Novum Millennio Iuniunte, Pope John Paul II developed, as the bishop pointed out, this wonderful spirituality of communion. Now, what I would like to do in this morning's reflections is to make some connections all around this idea of communion. I mean, communion is a beautiful concept. The difficulty is it can stay at the level of concept, a theological concept that has a certain level of abstraction. So what we want to do is to understand the notion of communion and relate it both to our personal lives as Christians, as followers of Christ, but also as a way of illuminating certain important issues facing us as a church. And that's what I would hope to do today. So, in that pastoral, that apostolic letter of Pope John Paul II, the Pope spoke of the church as a home and a school of communion. It's a wonderful image, a home and a school of communion. He did this as a way of suggesting that communion isn't just something abstract. It's something that's cultivated. It's something that's lived in the life of the church. Now, one of the strengths of this notion of communion is that it has its foundations in our very understanding of the triune God. That is to say, we believe that any spirituality of communion has its foundations in that God whom Jean Zizioulas referred to as being as communion. And so I want to say just a word about the Trinitarian foundations of spirituality of communion. One of the difficulties that I find in our church today when it comes to reflecting on our faith is that inevitably we suffer from a failure of the religious imagination. There was a modest little book published many decades ago that had the title, Your God is Too Small. And it seems to me this is the perennial difficulty that we have as Christians. Inevitably, the God we imagine is a God that is too small. A God that in some ways distorts rather than inspires and ennobles our faith. This is not a modern problem. This has haunted Christianity from its very beginnings. St. Augustine understood the dangers well. In one of his sermons, Sermon 117, I believe it was, he says, if you have understood, whatever you have understood is not God. And in a commentary on Psalm 21, he writes, are you contemplating what God is like? Whatever you imagine, God is not. Whatever you put in your mind, God is not. But if you would savor something of God, know this, that God is love. The same love by which we love one another. So St. Augustine knew that God could be known, could be encountered, but God could never be mastered, controlled, figured out the way my kids, study in chemistry, the periodic tables, and they master it, they move on to something else. Augustine wanted to say God's never mastered in that way. God is encountered in love. And so the most profound insight into God is to recognize, and this is the heart of communion, that God is perfect love. that God is loving relationship, and therefore we abide in God only to the extent that we are capable of that loving relationship. This is, then, it seems to me, our best path into understanding that God who is perfect, being His communion. When I talk to my students about this, I say, look, when you and I, as persons, we experience ourselves most fully as persons, not when we go off by ourselves, but when we engage others in relationship. What makes us persons is our capacity for relationship. But here's the situation. As much as all of us are sustained by relationships, we still experience ourselves as an individual I, an individual self who enters into or pulls out of relationships, even our most profound relationships. I've now been married for over 2 decades, and I would love to tell you that I have always been perfectly in relationship with my wife. But that's simply not true. And that's not a question of infidelity. That's simply a question of times in which I find myself resisting being present to her, withdrawing into the cocoon of my own world, preferring to read the newspaper or watch a baseball game than to engage her. Our marriage is a narrative of 2 people constantly striving to move into relationship, and yet knowing we never do so perfectly. All of us experience ourselves as persons who have relationships. We move into them, we move out of them. And yet the heart of a spirituality of communion is our recognition that God and God alone does not have relationships. God and God alone does not enter into relationships. God never comes close to us, for God has never been distant. God is loving relationship. God is communion. And the heart of any spirituality of communion, the heart of any ecclesiology of communion, starts with that insight. The communion is grounded in the life of God, whose very being is loving relationship. John Paul II said, church is a school of communion. It is in the life of the church that we come to learn how it is to live in communion, to be in loving, authentic, vulnerable relationship. And so I want to talk now about communion in the body of Christ. We had that wonderful reading in this morning's liturgy, in which we were introduced, of course, to Paul's favorite image for the church, one that he articulates both in 1 Corinthians 12 and in Romans 12. The image of the church as body. And here we find one of the first theological reflections on the life of communion, on the way in which the church is to be a school of communion. But it's a metaphor, quite honestly, that I think we are prone to domesticate. It's a word I love to use because I think this is one of the great dangers of our faith. The danger, the tendency to domesticate our faith, to tame it, to make it fit into our world rather than to allow the radicality of our faith to call us to conversion. And so, I believe in the modern world, subject to kind of the individualistic ethos of our time, we are prone to think of the metaphor of the body in a way, I think, quite different from Paul.